Assalamu alaikum. As a boy, I spent several years in Indonesia and heard the call of the azan at the break of dawn and at the fall of dusk. As a young man, I worked in Chicago communities where many found dignity and peace in their Muslim faith. As a student of history, I also know civilization's debt to Islam.
Welcome to the savage nation. The Middle East is burning, and the left wing is cheering. The Middle East is burning, and Obama is strangely silent, or is he? Welcome to the savage nation. This may prove to be the most difficult show I've done in a very long time, because I'm trying to contain and maintain an awful lot of ideas all at once. It just came out that the protests in Egypt have frankly been orchestrated by both the Bush and the Obama administration. The Telegraph UK just reported that America has secretly been backing rebel leaders behind the uprising in Egypt. We just read that the American embassy in Cairo helped a young dissident attend the U.S.-sponsored summit for so-called activists in New York City. While keeping his identity secret from Egyptian state police, he returned to Cairo not under Obama, but in December of 2008, while our treasury was being filched by Paulson and company, Bush et al., the activist was being coached by the U.S. State Department in a plan to overthrow President Hosni Mubarak and install a so-called democratic government in 2011. Now, let me pause right there. At the same time this is all going on, the giddy fools on MSNBC and CNN are sitting there cheering the burning of the streets of Cairo. They're saying that there's going to be a wonderful democracy that arises. Now, either these fools do not know what happened in Iran when Obama's predecessor, Jimmy Carter, did the same thing. Jimmy Carter called for reforms in Iran, and boy, did he get reforms. He undermined the Shah of Iran, who was a brutal dictator, because the Iranian people needed a brutal dictator in order to keep the Islamists under control. And what happened was Jimmy Carter was a, shall I say, dreamer, an idealist, utopian idealist, combined with his socialist leanings. And he said, well, democracy would be better than this dictator in Iran. So let the people have a revolution. We'll undermine the Shah of Iran, our greatest ally in Iran. And what happened next? The murderous Khomeini came back from exile in Paris, came back to Iran, and the virus of radical Islam was put in place. We wound up with hundreds of U.S. hostages for a very long period of time. You're watching history repeat itself, only this time it's not Jimmy Carter. This time it is Barack Hussein Obama. As I say, Egypt is in flames as the Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood attempt to overthrow the government of Egypt. The vermin at CNN and MSNBC is saying the Muslim Brotherhood is not behind it. That is nonsense. The morons in the midstream media are sitting there egging them on. The left would rather see Sharia law imposed over Egypt, ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood, than tolerate a strong leader who can hold his country together in the face of the Islamo-fascist threat. The root of all this is the WikiLeaks fiasco. The leftists at WikiLeaks released diplomatic cables that contributed to the revolution which occurred first in Tunisia. This then set Egypt on edge. They were pushed over the edge by what the WikiLeaks cables revealed to the world. What were they? It turns out that none other than Hillary Clinton was pushing very hard for so-called human rights in Egypt where this was not feasible. Do you understand why it's not feasible? Do you understand that democracy cannot thrive in a nation that is fundamentally not ready for it? In an ominous foreboding, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak feared that just such a situation might occur. He worried that the push from the United States for human rights would destabilize the Islamic nation, would encourage the Islamic revolution that deposed the Shah of Iran in 1980. It turns out that Mubarak was 100% right. And remember this, Should the Muslim Brotherhood seize control of the streets of Egypt? Should they topple the government in Yemen? Should the Islamic fundamentalists control both Egypt and Yemen? They will then control both sides of the Suez Canal. You haven't heard that yet on the media. You haven't yet seen that anywhere. But God forbid that day comes when the Islamic fundamentalists control both Egypt and Yemen. They will then control both ends of the Suez Canal, and we will see how the Prius peons deal with $10 or $15 a gallon gasoline. The phone number here is 1-800-449-8255. Again, I've got to go back to the main point. Mubarak, a dictator, but our ally. Mubarak has brought stability to Egypt for a very long period of time. Mubarak, in peace with Israel. Do you assume that the Muslim Brotherhood, if they get control of the Egyptian army, are going to stay at peace with Israel? Well, now you understand what's going on a little bit more, don't you? Now you understand why the leftists in our government want the radical Islamists to take over Egypt. They'd like to see Israel forced to give back the West Bank, so-called, so that there can be peace in the Middle East. That's their plan at the State Department. As though that will bring peace in the Middle East. It will not bring peace in the Middle East. It will bring further bloodshed in the Middle East. It will bring a nuclear war to the Middle East. But President Obama's push for democratic reforms, my friends, is either a form of Fabian socialism or a form of treason. I do not know the difference at this point. Here we had Secretary of State Hillary Clinton speaking on Friday while anti-government protests were rocking Egypt for a fourth day, and she was saying it was absolutely vital for Cairo to embrace political and social change, as the United States has been pushing for years. Is she out of her mind? Is she out of her mind? Social change is what Jimmy Carter wanted in Iran. And what happened was, into that vacuum came Ayatollah Khomeini, the radical Islamist. The hostages were taken. They were kept hostage for years, the U.S. hostages. And this is what's going to happen again. Mubarak saw what was coming. Mubarak said that this pressure from Clinton and Obama was ill-advised. He believed that this push for reform in the Middle East had produced colossal mistakes in the past, from the ouster of the Shah of Iran to the election of Hamas Islamists in Gaza. Remember, the Hamas Islamists in Gaza were elected democratically. I should also add that Hitler was elected democratically, by the way. So the cable said that we've heard from Mubarak. He's lamenting the results of early U.S. efforts to encourage reform in the Islamic world. He remembers back to the Shah of Iran, they said. The U.S. encouraged the Shah to accept reforms, only to watch Iran fall into the hands of revolutionary religious maniacs. Wherever Mubarak has seen these U.S. efforts for democracy, he sees chaos and the loss of stability. This all came out in the WikiLeaks cables, which leads me back to the whole scenario of WikiLeaks. I am more and more convinced that they're orchestrated by the U.S. government. They would never have happened had they not been released, permitted to be released by the U.S. government. I believe that this government is behind WikiLeaks. That is why you see nothing about issues that would not advance the leftist cause around the world. But that's a topic for another day. Right now you have to understand. You have to understand something. The Muslim Brotherhood is Egypt's largest opposition group. It favors a return to fundamentalist Islamic rules, as you see in Iran. Now, you say, well, we should support democracy. That's why the good people at MSNBC and the good people in the media are calling for democracy, and the happy young people who are texting and Facebooking each other to go out in the streets, and all they want is a representative government. Really? Where were they when the people were trying to overthrow the Hitler of our time 2 years ago, Ahmadinejad of Iran? There was a movement in the streets of Iran, yet the vermin at MSNBC, the vermin at CNN said nothing about it. They weren't celebrating the attempts at democracy in Iran at that time, were they? They had nothing negative to say about Ahmadinejad, the Hitler of our time, but they have a lot of hate to say about Mubarak. How is it possible that they hate Mubarak and they love Ahmadinejad? How is it that anti-religionists in America, secularists, pot-smoking lunatic leftists, have a love for a fascist Islamic dictator like Ahmadinejad? How is that possible? If you don't see the connection between worldwide socialism and radical Islam yet. You will see it very soon. Now, I have given you an awful lot of information thus far, and I realize that many of you know that there's riots going on. There are riots going on in Egypt. You're not quite sure what's going on, and you're not sure which side you're on. I think the best thing for me to do would be to pause right now, take your calls when I come back, and further elucidate exactly what is going on in Egypt and what's at stake for you.